Hello there. I'm a man who learned the hard way that sometimes the people you trust most are the ones who hurt you deepest. 5 years ago, I stood in a Detroit cemetery, rain soaking through my borrowed suit, as my foster parents, Frank and Martha, demanded I sign over my dead wife's insurance money. "Jackie," Frank said, his voice dripping with fake concern, "you owe us for raising you, don't you?" I walked away that day, leaving every penny of Sarah's $1 million legacy on my brother-in-law's workbench. Everyone said I was throwing my life away. But I knew something they didn't. Sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go of everything you have. Years later, when that garage experiment became a $10 billion company, Frank and Martha came back with lawyers, claiming they deserved half of everything I'd built. They called me a thief on national television. But the real shock came when I discovered what they'd been hiding all along. If you're hearing this story, tell me in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? Before we begin today's story, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Now, let me tell you what happened when the vultures finally got what they deserved. The rain fell like judgment on the cracked asphalt of Woodlawn Cemetery. Each drop struck the weathered headstones with the persistence of grief itself. Jack Miller stood alone beside the open grave, his calloused hands trembling as they clutched a soggy funeral home bill. The paper was disintegrating between his fingers, much like everything else in his life. 58 years of honest work had left their mark on Jack's frame. His shoulders curved inward from decades hunched over car engines. His knees ached with each step on the uneven cemetery ground. The black suit he wore hung loose on his diminished frame. He'd lost 20 pounds since Sarah's diagnosis 6 months ago. The fabric, borrowed from his neighbor, smelled faintly of mothballs and old cologne. The funeral director had vanished the moment the service ended. The few mourners who'd bothered to come had scattered like leaves in the wind. Sarah's co-workers from the research lab had offered polite condolences before hurrying back to their warm cars. Now only Jack remained, watching as 2 cemetery workers in yellow rain slickers lowered his wife's casket into the earth with mechanical precision. The casket disappeared inch by inch. Jack's throat tightened. Sarah had always hated the rain. She'd curl up by their apartment window during storms, sketching algorithms in her notebook while sipping chamomile tea. Her brilliant mind had always been working, always calculating, always one step ahead of everyone else in the room. "Goodbye, sweetheart," Jack whispered. His voice cracked on the words. The rain intensified. Water dripped from the brim of his borrowed hat, running down his weathered cheeks like tears he couldn't shed. The funeral bill in his hand showed $8,400 in bold red letters. Money he didn't have. Money he'd never have. Behind him, the low purr of an expensive engine cut through the steady patter of rain. Jack didn't turn around. He knew that sound. A black Lincoln Town car glided through the cemetery gates like a hearse, its polished surface reflecting the gray sky above. The vehicle moved with predatory grace between the headstones before coming to a stop 20 feet away. 2 car doors opened in perfect synchronization. Frank Kowalski stepped out first, his bulk filling a $1,000 overcoat. At 65, Frank carried himself with the swagger of a man who'd spent his life taking what didn't belong to him. His wife Martha followed, her bleached hair shellacked into a helmet that defied the wind and rain. She clutched a designer handbag against her chest like a shield. Jack's stomach turned. He'd been dreading this moment since the moment Sarah died. "Jackie," Frank called out, his voice carrying false warmth. "Look at you, standing out here in the rain like some lost dog." Jack slowly turned to face them. Frank and Martha approached with measured steps, their expensive shoes clicking against the wet pavement. Neither looked at Sarah's grave. They never had any love for her. Sarah had been too smart, too independent, too willing to see through their manipulation. "We came as soon as we heard," Martha said, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue. "Such a tragedy. Sarah was so young." Jack said nothing. He studied their faces, searching for any trace of genuine grief. He found none. Frank's eyes were calculating, already moving toward the business at hand. Martha's expression held nothing but practiced sympathy, the kind she'd perfected during 40 years of foster care fraud. "Now, Jackie," Frank continued, reaching into his coat. "We need to talk about practical matters. About your future. From his inner pocket, Frank produced a manila envelope. The paper was crisp and dry, protected from the rain that was soaking Jack to the bone. Frank's manicured fingers extracted a legal document with official letterhead. Beneficiary change consent form, Frank announced, holding the papers just out of Jack's reach. Sarah left you quite a windfall, didn't she? $1 million from the insurance company. Jack's jaw tightened. The insurance money was Sarah's gift to him, her way of ensuring he'd be taken care of after she was gone. They'd discussed it during her final weeks in the hospital, her thin fingers intertwined with his as machines beeped steadily around them. That's my business, Jack said quietly. Martha stepped forward, her heels sinking slightly into the soft earth beside the grave. Oh, honey, look at yourself. When was the last time you paid rent on time? When did you last have steady work? Her voice dripped with false concern. You're a credit risk, Jackie. A gambling problem, drinking issues, can't hold down a job. Each word hit Jack like a physical blow. The gambling had been 20 years ago, during the worst period of his life. The drinking had stopped 15 years back, when Sarah gave him an ultimatum. But Frank and Martha had always been experts at weaponizing his past mistakes. We raised you, Frank added, his voice hardening around the edges. Put a roof over your head when nobody else would take you in. Fed you, clothed you, gave you a family name. He paused, letting the weight of manufactured obligation settle between them. Don't you think you owe us something for all those years of sacrifice? Jack's hands clenched into fists. The funeral bill crumpled in his grip. They hadn't raised him out of love. They'd raised him for the monthly checks from the state, along with 17 other foster children who'd cycled through their house over the decades. Jack had been their longest-staying source of income, lasting nearly 10 years before aging out of the system. Let us manage that money for you, Martha continued, her tone becoming more insistent. We'll make sure it lasts, make sure you don't throw it all away like everything else in your life. Frank extended the consent form again, this time pressing it closer to Jack's chest. Just sign this, and we'll take care of everything. You won't have to worry about budgets or investments or any of that complicated financial stuff. Jack looked down at the document. The legal language swam before his eyes, but he could make out enough to understand its purpose. If he signed, Frank and Martha would have complete control over Sarah's insurance payout. They would become the trustees, doling out money to Jack as they saw fit. They would own him, just as they had when he was 16 and desperate for approval. You can live comfortably, Frank pressed. We'll get you a nice little apartment, maybe help you find some part-time work. Nothing too stressful. You'll be set for life. The rain continued to fall. Water pooled in the hollow spaces around Sarah's grave, turning the freshly dug earth into thick mud. Jack stared at the dark soil, imagining his wife's body beneath it. Sarah, who'd worked 16-hour days in the lab, whose brilliant mind had been developing medical research algorithms that could help thousands of patients. Sarah, who'd never taken a handout from anyone in her life. From his coat pocket, Jack slowly withdrew a worn leather journal. The cover was cracked and stained from years of use, held together with a rubber band. Sarah had carried this notebook everywhere during their marriage, filling its pages with complex equations, research notes, and breakthrough observations. It represented her life's work, her contribution to the world. Frank's eyes zeroed in on the journal immediately. His expression darkened with disgust. What's that old thing? Frank sneered. More of Sarah's nerd garbage? Jack's grip tightened on the journal. It's her research notes. Her life's work. Trash, Frank spat. Absolute garbage. You need to stop living in the past, Jackie. Sarah's dead. Her scribbling won't bring her back. Before Jack could react, Frank's hand shot out like a striking snake. His fingers connected with the journal, knocking it from Jack's surprised grip. The precious notebook tumbled through the air, its pages fluttering like wounded wings before landing with a wet slap in the mud beside Sarah's grave. Time seemed to freeze. Jack watched in horror as years of his wife's brilliant work lay scattered in the filth. Some pages had come loose from the binding, their equations now smeared with dirty water. The rubber band had snapped, allowing loose notes to scatter in the wind. Martha laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the rain. See? It's just paper, honey. Worthless paper. Frank looked down at the ruined journal with satisfaction. Then, with deliberate malice, he lifted his expensive leather shoe and brought it down hard on the notebook's cover. His heel ground into the leather, pressing it deeper into the mud. "That's what I think of Sarah's precious research," Frank said coldly. "And that's what the world thinks too. Nobody cares about a dead woman's scribblings." Something inside Jack's chest cracked open like a dam breaking. The grief he'd been holding back, the rage he'd been swallowing, the years of accumulated humiliation all rushed together in a wave of cold fury. His vision narrowed until all he could see was Frank's polished shoe crushing his wife's legacy into the dirt. Without thinking, Jack dropped to his knees in the mud. His expensive borrowed pants soaked through immediately, but he didn't care. His hands moved with desperate precision, scooping up the scattered pages and cradling the damaged journal against his chest. Mud stained his white shirt as he used the fabric to gently wipe dirt from the leather cover. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. "I'm so sorry." Above him, Frank and Martha exchanged satisfied glances. They'd seen Jack broken before. They knew how to reduce him to this state of servile desperation. Frank reached for the consent form again, confident that Jack would sign anything now. But as Jack knelt in the mud, something fundamental shifted behind his eyes. The grief was still there, raw and overwhelming. But beneath it, a new emotion was taking root. Cold, calculating rage. The kind of anger that didn't explode outward but turned inward, hardening into something diamond-sharp and unbreakable. Jack's hands stopped trembling as he gathered the last of Sarah's scattered notes. His breathing steadied. When he finally looked up at Frank and Martha, his gaze held something they'd never seen before. Not the desperate gratitude of an abandoned foster child. Not the broken despair of a grieving widower. Determination. "You think I owe you," Jack said quietly, his voice carrying a new edge. "You think you can take what Sarah left me." He stood slowly, cradling the journal in his muddy hands. Rain ran down his face in steady streams, but his eyes remained fixed on his former guardians. "You're wrong," Jack continued, each word carefully measured. "Sarah didn't work herself to death to fund your retirement. And I'm not signing anything." Frank's confident smile faltered slightly. "Now, Jackie, don't be stupid. You need us. You've always needed us." "No," Jack said simply. "I don't." The wind picked up, howling between the headstones with renewed fury. The rain fell harder, turning the cemetery into a landscape of flowing water and shifting shadows. In the distance, lightning flickered across the dark sky. Jack tucked Sarah's journal inside his coat, protecting it from further damage. He took one last look at his wife's grave, now partially obscured by pooling rainwater. Then he turned his back on Frank and Martha and began walking toward the cemetery gates. "You'll be back," Frank shouted after him. "You'll come crawling back like you always do." But Jack didn't turn around. His footsteps splashed steadily through the puddles, each step taking him further from the only family he'd ever known. Behind him, Frank and Martha stood beside the black Lincoln, their expensive clothes and confident expressions suddenly seeming less impressive in the growing storm. Thunder rumbled overhead as Jack reached his rusted pickup truck. He climbed into the driver's seat with slow, deliberate movements. His muddy hands gripped the steering wheel as he sat in the cab, listening to the rain drum against the metal roof. Inside his coat, Sarah's journal pressed against his chest like a beating heart. He could feel the damaged pages, could sense the years of brilliant work that Frank had tried to destroy. But it wasn't destroyed. It was still there, still whole despite the mud and water. Just like Jack himself. He started the engine, and the old truck roared to life with a sound like distant thunder. As he pulled away from the cemetery, Jack caught a final glimpse of Frank and Martha in his rearview mirror. They were arguing beside their expensive car, their perfect facades cracking in the relentless rain. The sound of the storm grew louder as Jack drove into the darkness beyond the cemetery gates, but beneath it all, another sound could be heard. The grinding of teeth, sharp and purposeful, as cold determination. Took root in the heart of a man who had finally learned the difference between grief and rage. 3 days after the funeral, Jack sat in his pickup truck outside First National Bank of Detroit. The engine ticked as it cooled in the morning air. Through the windshield, he could see downtown's skeletal remains. Empty office buildings stretched toward a gray sky like broken teeth. Half the storefronts were boarded up with plywood, covered in graffiti and old campaign posters from elections nobody remembered. Jack's hands rested on the steering wheel. Sarah's insurance check lay on the passenger seat beside him. $1 million, printed in neat black numbers that seemed to mock the decay surrounding them. The paper was crisp and official, bearing the signatures of executives who'd never set foot in a place like Detroit. He thought about Frank and Martha's words at the cemetery. Credit risk. Gambling problem. Can't hold down a job. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was everything they said he was. But Sarah had believed in him enough to make him the sole beneficiary. That had to count for something. The bank's glass doors reflected his image as he approached. 58 years old, wearing the same muddy clothes from the funeral. He looked like exactly the kind of man who didn't belong in a financial institution. The security guard's eyes followed him as he crossed the marble lobby. "I need to deposit this," Jack said quietly, sliding the check across the teller's counter. The young woman behind the glass partition blinked twice at the amount. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard as she processed the transaction. Jack could feel other customers staring, could hear whispered conversations about the homeless man with the $1 million check. 20 minutes later, he walked out with a cashier's check for the full amount. The paper felt weightless in his pocket, but it carried the gravity of his entire future. Every decision from this moment forward would determine whether Sarah's sacrifice meant something or whether Frank and Martha had been right all along. Jack drove east through neighborhoods that looked like war zones. Abandoned houses stood like sentinels over empty lots where children once played. The GPS on his old phone directed him through streets where working factories had once provided steady employment for 3 generations. Now only rust and broken windows remained. The garage sat at the end of a dead-end street, surrounded by chain-link fence topped with razor wire. It had been a transmission repair shop once, before the economy collapsed and the customers disappeared. Now it served as Leo's fortress against the world that wanted to destroy him. Jack's brother-in-law had always been different. While other kids played video games, Leo built computers from spare parts. While teenagers chased girls, Leo wrote code that made grown men weep with its elegance. Sarah had spotted his potential early, encouraging his education when his own parents had written him off as a dreamer. An orange eviction notice was plastered across the garage's front door like a warning sign. The paper fluttered in the wind, its edges already beginning to tear. Behind the notice, Jack could see movement through the grimy windows. Leo was still inside, still fighting whatever battles he fought in the digital realm. Jack knocked twice on the side door. The sound echoed hollowly in the empty space around them. After a moment, several locks clicked open in sequence. Leo's face appeared in the crack, his left eye purple and swollen nearly shut. Blood had dried at the corner of his mouth. "Jesus, Leo," Jack breathed. Leo opened the door wider, revealing the full extent of his condition. His lip was split down the middle, held together with butterfly bandages. Bruises covered his ribs in shades of purple and yellow. His left hand was wrapped in an ace bandage. "Loan sharks?" Jack asked. Leo nodded, stepping aside to let Jack enter. "They came yesterday. Wanted the server equipment as collateral." He gestured toward the corner where multiple computer towers hummed quietly. "I told them no." The garage had been converted into a makeshift laboratory. Cables snaked across the concrete floor like electronic vines. Monitors displayed streams of code that moved too quickly for Jack to follow. The air smelled of coffee, solder, and the particular electricity that comes from machines pushed to their limits. Leo moved carefully, favoring his right side as he walked. Despite the beating, his eyes remained sharp and focused. He'd been working, Jack realized. Even with broken ribs and a split lip, Leo had been coding through the night. "How much do you owe them?" Jack asked. 40,000, Leo replied, not looking up from his keyboard. "But it's not about the money anymore. They want me to stop working on Sarah's project. Someone's been asking questions about the algorithm." Jack felt something cold settle in his stomach. What kind of questions? The kind that come with briefcases full of cash and non-disclosure agreements. Leo finally turned to face Jack, his swollen features serious. "Sarah was onto something big, Jack. Bigger than either of us realized." On the main monitor, streams of medical data flowed past in organized patterns. Jack recognized some of the terminology from conversations with Sarah during her final weeks. Cancer treatment protocols, drug interaction matrices, patient outcome predictions. Her life's work, translated into digital form. She was developing a diagnostic algorithm, Leo explained, his voice gaining energy despite his injuries. Something that could analyze patient symptoms and predict treatment outcomes with 97% accuracy. It could revolutionize how doctors approach cancer treatment. Jack stared at the screen, watching numbers cascade past like digital rain. Each data point represented a patient, a family, a life hanging in the balance. Sarah had worked on this for 15 years, through late nights and weekend sessions. Driven by a vision of reducing human suffering through mathematical precision. The pharmaceutical companies found out, Leo continued. They don't want accurate diagnostics. They want patients cycling through expensive treatments for as long as possible. He gestured at his bruised face. This was their gentle way of asking me to stop. The implications hit Jack like a physical blow. Sarah hadn't just died from cancer. She'd died fighting a system designed to profit from prolonged suffering. Her research threatened billions of dollars in revenue from ineffective treatments and unnecessary procedures. How close are you to finishing? Jack asked. Leo's eyes lit up with a mixture of excitement and desperation. 6 months. Maybe 4 if I can work without interruption. He paused, looking around the shabby garage. But I need equipment, better security, legal protection. Things that cost money I don't have. Jack reached into his pocket and withdrew the cashier's check. He placed it on Leo's desk next to the keyboard, the paper looking impossibly white against the grimy surface. Leo stared at the check for a long moment. His hands trembled as he reached for it, his fingers tracing the printed numbers as if they might disappear at any second. Jack, this is. Leo's voice failed him. Every cent I have, Jack finished quietly. Sarah's insurance money. I can't take this, Leo protested. This is your security, your future. Without this money, you'll have nothing. Jack looked around the garage, taking in the servers, the cables, the monitors displaying Sarah's life's work. In the distance, police sirens wailed through the Detroit afternoon. Time was running out for all of them. Don't use this for debts, Jack said firmly. Finish Sarah's algorithm, make it work. And don't look for me until you make it. Leo's eyes filled with tears, the moisture making his bruises look even more pronounced. Where will you go? Somewhere they can't find me, Jack replied. Somewhere I can disappear until you're ready. He turned toward the door, but Leo's voice stopped him. Jack, wait. What if I fail? What if I can't make this work? Jack paused with his hand on the door handle. Outside, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed between the abandoned buildings. Time was up. Then we both fail together, Jack said. But we fail trying to honor Sarah's memory instead of letting Frank and Martha steal it. Leo wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, leaving streaks of dirt on his cheeks. I swear on my life, I won't waste a single cent. Sarah's work will live on. Jack nodded once, then stepped out into the fading daylight. Behind him, Leo was already turning back to his computers, the $1 million check clutched in his bandaged hand like a sacred text. As Jack climbed into his pickup truck, he caught sight of 2 black SUVs turning onto the street. The loan sharks were returning, probably with reinforcements this time. But Leo would be gone soon, along with the servers and Sarah's precious algorithm. The money would buy him time, protection, and the resources needed to complete what Sarah had started. Jack started his engine and pulled away from the garage, watching in his rearview mirror as the SUVs came to a stop outside the empty building. By the time the men in expensive suits realized what had happened, Leo would be halfway across the state with everything he needed to change the world. The highway stretched ahead like a ribbon of possibility. Jack had no destination in mind, no plan beyond putting distance between himself and everyone who wanted to control his life. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt something approaching peace. Behind him, Detroit disappeared into the gathering dusk. Ahead lay the unknown territories of a country that still offered refuge to those willing to disappear completely. Jack pressed the accelerator and drove toward whatever came next, carrying nothing but Sarah's muddy journal and the hope that he'd made the right choice. West Texas stretched endlessly in all directions, a landscape of scrub brush and broken dreams under a sky that seemed to go on forever. Jack had been driving for 3 days when his pickup truck finally gave up outside a town called Odessa. The engine seized with a sound like grinding bones, steam rising from under the hood in the 110-degree heat. That was 5 years ago. Now Jack stood in the bathroom of the Cactus Flower Trailer Park, staring at his reflection in a cracked mirror held together with duct tape. The man looking back at him bore little resemblance to the grieving widower who'd left Detroit. His face was weathered like old leather from years under the Texas sun. His hair had gone completely gray. His hands, once merely calloused from honest work, were now scarred and twisted from industrial accidents. The alarm on his phone buzzed insistently. 4:30 in the morning. Time to get ready for another shift at the refinery. Jack reached for the medicine cabinet, his fingers automatically finding the prescription bottle that had become his most faithful companion. OxyContin, 40 milligrams tablets. The label was worn smooth from handling. He shook 2 pills into his palm, then hesitated. The bottle was nearly empty again. His back screamed with pain that radiated down his left leg like liquid fire. 2 pills would get him through the morning. 3 would let him finish his shift. But 3 was more than he was supposed to take. Jack dry swallowed 3 pills. The trailer park was quiet at this hour. Most of the residents worked day shifts at various industrial facilities scattered across the desert. They were good people, for the most part. Men and women who'd lost factory jobs in Michigan or Pennsylvania and followed the oil boom to Texas. They asked few questions and offered practical help when times got tough. Jack's trailer sat at the end of the 3rd row, a rusted single-wide that had seen better decades. The previous owner had abandoned it when the lease came due, leaving behind a structure that leaked when it rained and baked like an oven during the summer months. Jack paid $200 a month for the privilege of calling it home. He opened his mailbox as he passed, though he knew what he'd find there. Bills, mostly. Medical collection notices from the emergency room visit 6 months ago when he'd passed out at the refinery. A letter from Social Security Administration with "claim denied" stamped across the front in red ink. At the bottom of the pile, a notice from the electric company threatened disconnection in 7 days for non-payment. Jack had been putting off the bill for 3 months, paying just enough to keep the power on. He crumpled the notice and shoved it into his pocket with the others. The walk to the refinery took 25 minutes on foot. Jack had lost his driver's license after falling asleep behind the wheel during a particularly bad pain episode. The judge had been understanding, recognizing that Jack wasn't a drunk driver but rather a man whose body was betraying him one vertebra at a time. Still, the law was the law. The refinery stretched across several acres of concrete and steel, its towers reaching toward the dawn sky like industrial prayers. Flare stacks burned constantly, turning excess gas into pillars of flame that could be seen for miles across the desert. The facility employed nearly 300 workers across 3 shifts, processing crude oil into gasoline, diesel, and chemical feedstocks. Jack clocked in at gate security, joining the stream of hard-hatted workers heading toward their respective assignments. His current job involved monitoring pressure gauges in the distillation unit, walking predetermined routes through a maze of pipes and tanks while recording readings on a clipboard. It wasn't skilled work, but it paid $15 an hour and required minimal interaction with supervisors who might ask awkward questions about his past. The pills kicked in as he reached his station. The constant ache in his lower back faded to a manageable throb. His left leg stopped sending shooting pains up to his hip. For the next 6 hours, Jack would feel almost human. He pulled the clipboard from its metal housing and began his first round of the day. Temperature readings, pressure levels, flow rates. Numbers that meant little to him but apparently mattered to engineers in air-conditioned offices who made 3 times his salary. Jack recorded each figure with mechanical precision, his handwriting steady despite the medication coursing through his system. The work was mindless, which suited him perfectly. His mind was free to wander while his body went through the motions of industrial employment. Most days, he thought about Sarah. He wondered what she would think of his current circumstances, whether she'd be proud that he'd honored her memory or disappointed that he'd fallen so far. Sometimes he thought about Leo. In the early days, Jack had followed tech news obsessively, searching for any mention of Sarah's algorithm or breakthrough medical software. But the articles were written in language he couldn't understand, filled with terms like machine learning and predictive analytics that meant nothing to a man whose education had ended with high school. Eventually, Jack had stopped looking. The world of technology felt as distant as the surface of Mars. He'd made his choice 5 years ago, betting everything on Leo's potential. Either it would work or it wouldn't. Either way, Jack's part in the story was over. By lunch break, the temperature had climbed above 100 degrees. Jack found shade behind the cooling tower and unwrapped the peanut butter sandwich that constituted his daily meal. The bread was stale, but protein was protein. He'd learned to stretch a loaf for a full week by eating carefully and supplementing with whatever canned goods he could afford. His phone buzzed with a text message. The area code was unfamiliar, probably another debt collector who'd tracked down his number. Jack deleted the message without reading it. He'd learned that ignoring creditors was easier than trying to explain why a man with no assets couldn't pay medical bills that exceeded his annual income. After lunch, Jack's back began to seize up despite the morning medication. Each step sent spikes of pain through his nervous system. He found himself leaning against pipe supports more frequently, taking longer breaks between readings. The foreman noticed but said nothing. In an industry where workers regularly destroyed their bodies for modest wages, chronic pain was considered part of the job. At 3 o'clock, Jack took his 4th pill of the day. It was more than his prescription allowed, but the alternative was collapsing on the job and losing the only source of income he had. The medication hit his empty stomach like a warm wave, washing away not just the pain, but also his ability to think clearly about anything except the immediate task of putting one foot in front of the other. The shift ended at 6 o'clock. Jack clocked out and joined the exodus of tired workers heading toward the parking lot. He walked alone, as always, his shadow stretching long across the asphalt in the fading daylight. Behind him, the refinery continued its ceaseless operation, processing crude oil into the products that kept American civilization running. The walk home took longer than usual. Jack found himself stopping frequently to rest, his breathing labored despite the cooling evening air. The pills were wearing off, leaving behind a pain that seemed deeper and more vicious than before. His left leg dragged slightly with each step. The trailer park was coming to life as the day shift workers returned home. Children played between the mobile homes while their parents prepared dinner on portable grills. The smell of cooking meat made Jack's empty stomach clench with hunger, but he'd learned to ignore such sensations. Food was a luxury that came after rent, utilities, and medication. Inside his trailer, Jack opened the refrigerator and surveyed his options. A half-empty jar of peanut butter, 3 slices of bread, and a can of expired soup that he'd been saving for a special occasion. He chose the soup, heating it on the single-burner stove while trying not to think about the collection notices in his pocket. The local news played on his second-hand television, the sound crackling through speakers that had seen better decades. Stories about crop failures and border security, local politics and high school football. The world beyond West Texas felt like fiction, a place where other people lived lives that mattered. Then a business report mentioned something about Silicon Valley startups and venture capital funding. Jack reached for the remote to change the channel, but his hand froze as the reporter continued speaking. Sarah Tech continues its meteoric rise, with insiders suggesting the company's medical diagnostic software could revolutionize healthcare. Jack stared at the screen, his heart hammering against his ribs. Sarah Tech. The name felt like a physical blow, carrying memories of his wife's late-night research sessions and Leo's swollen face in that Detroit garage. After 5 years of silence, Leo had apparently succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. The news segment lasted 30 seconds before moving on to sports scores. Jack sat in his folding chair, the soup cooling in his lap as he processed what he'd just heard. Sarah's algorithm was real. It was working. It was changing the world, just as she'd always believed it would. And Jack had no part in any of it. The realization should have brought happiness, or at least satisfaction. Instead, Jack felt nothing but a hollow ache that had nothing to do with his damaged spine. He'd gambled everything on Leo's success and apparently won. But victory felt indistinguishable from loss when you weren't alive to enjoy it. Jack turned off the television and ate his soup in darkness. Outside his window, the lights of the refinery painted the desert sky orange and red. Tomorrow would bring another shift, another day of recording numbers that meant nothing to him. Another day of pills and pain and the slow dissolution of whatever remained of his former life. He reached for the medicine bottle on his nightstand, shaking out his evening dose. 2 pills for pain, 1 extra for sleep. As the medication took hold, Jack closed his eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to hope for something beyond mere survival. But hope, like so many other things, was a luxury he could no longer afford. The desert wind rattled his trailer's thin walls, and Jack drifted off to sleep wondering if Sarah would still recognize the man he'd become. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning during the worst heatwave West Texas had seen in 20 years. Jack was climbing a maintenance ladder to check pressure readings on the upper distillation tower when his left leg simply stopped working. One moment he was ascending steadily despite the pain, the next moment he was falling backward through empty air with nothing but concrete 40 feet below. He hit the safety platform on the way down, his shoulder striking the metal grating with a sound like breaking wood. The impact spun him sideways before he tumbled over the platform's edge and continued falling toward the ground level. His last conscious thought was that Sarah would be disappointed in him for dying in such a stupid way. Jack woke up in the emergency room of Odessa Regional Medical Center. Staring at ceiling tiles stained yellow from decades of cigarette smoke and industrial air pollution. His left arm was immobilized in a cast from shoulder to wrist. His ribs were wrapped in bandages that made breathing feel like drowning in reverse. The pain was extraordinary, cutting through the hospital-grade morphine-like acid through paper. "Mr. Miller?" A young doctor with tired eyes appeared beside his bed. "I'm Drive Vasquez. You've been unconscious for 6 hours." Jack tried to speak, but his throat felt like sandpaper. Dr. Vasquez offered him ice chips, which melted on Jack's tongue like tiny blessings. "How bad?" Jack croaked. "Fractured shoulder, 3 broken ribs, severe bruising throughout your torso. You're lucky to be alive." Dr. Vasquez consulted his tablet. "But I'm more concerned about what caused the fall. Your blood work shows dangerous levels of prescription opioids." Jack closed his eyes. He'd been taking too many pills for months, chasing after relief that stayed consistently 1 step ahead of the medication. The tolerance had built up gradually, forcing him to increase his dosage just to function at work. "We had to run your identification through our system, Drive," Vasquez continued, "for insurance purposes. That triggered some kind of alert in our network." "What kind of alert?" Before the doctor could answer, the emergency room erupted in chaos. Jack heard the unmistakable sound of helicopter rotors approaching, growing louder until they seemed to be directly overhead. The building shook slightly as a large aircraft landed somewhere nearby. Through the ER's windows, Jack could see people in expensive suits running across the parking lot. Security guards with earpieces formed a perimeter around something he couldn't see. The hospital's staff gathered at the windows, pointing and talking in excited whispers. "What the hell is going on?" Jack asked. Dr. Vasquez looked as confused as everyone else. "I have no idea, but someone very important apparently wants to see you." The doors burst open with enough force to rattle the glass panels. A tall figure in a charcoal suit strode through the chaos, moving with the kind of confidence that comes from never hearing the word, no. Behind him, a small army of assistants, lawyers, and security personnel formed a protective formation. It took Jack several seconds to recognize the face beneath the expensive haircut and professionally whitened teeth. Leo had gained 30 pounds, all of it in the shoulders and chest from what looked like a personal trainer's careful work. His clothes probably cost more than Jack made in 6 months. A watch that resembled a small computer gleamed on his wrist. But it was definitely Leo. The same intelligent eyes, the same slight tilt of his head when processing information. Jack's broken brother-in-law had somehow transformed into a figure who could shut down an entire hospital with a phone call. Leo stopped dead when he saw Jack's condition. The cast, the bandages, the hospital gown that had seen better decades. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, grief, rage, and finally something that looked like relief mixed with overwhelming guilt. "Jesus Christ, Jack," Leo whispered. Without warning, Leo dropped to his knees beside the hospital bed. His expensive suit hit the linoleum floor, probably ruining fabric that cost more than Jack's trailer. Leo pressed his forehead against Jack's uninjured hand, his shoulders shaking with suppressed emotion. "I'm so sorry," Leo said, his voice muffled against the hospital blanket. "I'm so sorry I'm late." Jack stared down at the crown of Leo's head, trying to process what was happening. Around them, the hospital staff maintained a respectful distance, clearly understanding that they were witnessing something private and important. "Leo?" Jack's voice came out weaker than he intended. "What are you doing here?" Leo lifted his head, revealing eyes that were red-rimmed with unshed tears. "I've been looking for you for 2 years, Jack. Ever since the company went public. I hired private investigators, security firms, even contacted the FBI. But you disappeared completely." "I was hiding," Jack admitted. "From Frank and Martha, from anyone who might want to take Sarah's money." "Sarah's money?" Leo looked confused for a moment, then understanding dawned on his features. "Jack, you don't understand. The $1 million you gave me, that wasn't just a loan. Legally, it made you a founding partner. A 50% stakeholder." Jack tried to sit up straighter, but the pain in his ribs forced him back down. "What are you talking about?" Leo reached into his jacket and withdrew a tablet computer. His fingers moved across the screen with practiced efficiency, pulling up what looked like stock market information. Numbers and charts that meant nothing to Jack filled the display. "Sarah Tech went public 8 months ago," Leo explained, turning the tablet so Jack could see the screen. "Our diagnostic algorithm is being used in over 3,000 hospitals worldwide. We're processing medical data for 12 million patients annually. The company is valued at $10 billion. The numbers seemed to float in front of Jack's eyes without connecting to any meaningful reality. 10 billion was a figure so large that it lost all practical meaning. It was like trying to visualize the distance to the moon. "Your 50% share," Leo continued, "is currently worth just over $5 billion. But that's not counting your liquid assets." "My what?" Leo swiped to another screen, revealing a bank balance that made Jack's vision blur around the edges. The number had 9 digits, more money than he could spend in a dozen lifetimes. "I've been setting aside your portion of the profits since we launched," Leo explained. "It's been accumulating in secure accounts, waiting for you to claim it. As of yesterday, your personal liquid assets total approximately $100 million. Jack stared at the screen, his brain refusing to process what he was seeing. 24 hours ago, he'd been eating expired soup in a trailer that leaked when it rained. Now Leo was telling him he was worth more money than some small countries. "This is impossible," Jack whispered. "It's not just possible, it's happening. And it's all because of what you did 5 years ago." Leo's voice carried a weight of absolute conviction. "Without your investment, without your faith in Sarah's work, none of this would exist. You saved everything, Jack." Around them, the hospital bustled with activity as staff prepared for Jack's immediate transfer to whatever medical facility Leo deemed appropriate. Money, Jack realized, could solve problems he hadn't even known existed. "Where are we going?" Jack asked. "Home," Leo replied simply. "You're going to live like a king now, Jack. Because that's what you are. The king who sacrificed everything for his queen's memory." As they prepared to move Jack to the helicopter, he caught sight of himself in the reflection of a window. The broken old man in the hospital bed looked nothing like a king. But for the first time in 5 years, Jack allowed himself to believe that maybe Sarah's sacrifice had meant something after all. The helicopter lifted off with a sound like controlled thunder, carrying Jack away from the desert that had nearly claimed his life and toward a future he couldn't begin to imagine. The helicopter landed on a rooftop helipad surrounded by gardens that looked like they belonged in a magazine. Jack peered through the aircraft's window at a house that defied his understanding of residential architecture. The structure sprawled across several acres, its modern glass and steel design reflecting the California sunshine like a crystalline dream. "Welcome home," Leo said simply. Jack was transferred to an ambulance that drove him through gates that could have defended a medieval castle. The property stretched beyond what his eyes could take in, featuring manicured lawns that probably required a full-time staff to maintain. In the distance, he could see tennis courts, a swimming pool that resembled a small lake, and what appeared to be a stable complex. The medical team that received him moved with the efficiency of a military operation. Within an hour, Jack found himself in a guest suite larger than most people's homes, surrounded by equipment that belonged in a major hospital. A team of specialists examined his injuries while discussing treatment options in hushed, professional tones. Dr. Catherine Morrison, the orthopedic surgeon Leo had flown in from Johns Hopkins, explained that Jack's shoulder would heal completely with proper care. The broken ribs would mend within 6 weeks. But the damage to his spine from 5 years of industrial labor would require more aggressive intervention. "We can fix this, drive," Morrison assured him, showing Jack X-rays on a wall-mounted monitor. "Spinal fusion surgery, followed by 6 months of rehabilitation. You'll walk without pain for the first time in years." Jack stared at the images of his damaged vertebrae, white shadows against the dark background of the film. Each compressed disc represented a year of suffering, a season of pills taken just to get through another shift at the refinery. "How much will it cost?" Jack asked automatically. Dr. Morrison smiled. "Mr. Miller, cost isn't a consideration anymore. Your insurance," she gestured vaguely toward Leo, who was standing by the window, "covers everything." That evening, after the medical team had departed, and the pain medication had reduced his discomfort to manageable levels, Leo joined Jack on the suite's private balcony. The view stretched across Silicon Valley toward San Francisco Bay, a landscape of prosperity that seemed to go on forever. "I need to show you something," Leo said, carrying a leather portfolio under his arm. He opened the portfolio and withdrew a document with official letterhead. "Stock transfer deed," the title read. Jack's name appeared in bold letters at the top, followed by numbers that still seemed like fiction. "This makes it official," Leo explained. "You're not just a beneficiary, Jack. You're a co-founder. Equal partners, just like Sarah would have wanted." Jack studied the document, trying to make sense of the legal language. "Leo, I didn't found anything. I just gave you money and disappeared." "You gave me everything you had," Leo replied firmly. "More importantly, you gave me something nobody else would. You believed in Sarah's work when the whole world thought it was worthless scribbling in a notebook." Leo reached into the portfolio again and withdrew something that made Jack's breath catch in his throat. Sarah's leather journal, the one that Frank had knocked into the mud at the cemetery. But it was different now, restored and preserved behind protective glass in a custom frame. "I had it professionally restored," Leo said quietly. "Every page, every equation. It's the foundation document for everything we've built." Jack took the framed journal with trembling hands. The leather cover had been cleaned and conditioned until it looked almost new. The pages were visible through the glass, Sarah's handwriting clear and precise despite the water damage it had sustained. Mathematical formulas that Jack couldn't understand filled every available space. "Without this book, there is no company," Leo continued. "Without your faith in me, none of Sarah's work would have seen the light of day. You didn't just invest money, Jack. You invested in a dream that everyone else thought was impossible." Through the balcony's glass doors, Jack could see a black Amex card sitting on his bedside table. Leo had presented it earlier, explaining that it was connected to accounts containing more money than Jack could spend in several lifetimes. But somehow, the restored journal felt more valuable than all the wealth in the world. "I want you to understand something," Leo said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute sincerity. "Every patient whose life is saved by Sarah's algorithm owes their survival partly to you. Every family that doesn't have to watch their loved one die from misdiagnosed cancer benefits from your sacrifice." Jack pressed his face against the cool glass protecting Sarah's journal. Her equations stared back at him, the mathematical language she'd used to decode the mysteries of human suffering. He could almost see her hands moving across the pages, her brilliant mind working through problems that had defeated entire research teams. "The peace doesn't last long, though," Leo said, his tone shifting to something darker. "Frank and Martha surfaced about 6 months ago." Jack looked up sharply. "What do you mean, surfaced?" "They hired lawyers. Big ones. They're claiming you stole money that rightfully belonged to them." Leo pulled out his phone and showed Jack a news article. "They went on national television last week." The headline read, "Foster parents claim tech billionaire stole their retirement fund." Below it was a photo of Frank and Martha, both looking older but no less predatory than Jack remembered. Martha was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue while Frank pointed accusingly at the camera. Jack read the article with growing horror. Frank and Martha claimed they'd been saving money to help their son, Jack, start a business. According to their version of events, Jack had manipulated them into signing financial documents while they were grieving Sarah's death. They painted themselves as elderly victims of a sophisticated con artist. "It's all lies," Jack said. "Of course it's lies," Leo agreed. "But they have good lawyers and a compelling story. Poor old folks versus the evil tech billionaire." He paused. "They're demanding 50% of your stake in the company." Jack sank back into his wheelchair, the weight of old trauma settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat. Even here, surrounded by luxury he'd never imagined possible, Frank and Martha could still reach him. They were like emotional viruses, infecting everything they touched with their particular brand of poison. "Leo, I don't have the strength to fight them," Jack admitted. 5 years in the desert, the pills, the pain. "I'm not the same man who gave you that money." Leo knelt beside Jack's wheelchair, his expensive suit once again hitting the floor without regard for the cost. "You don't have to fight them, Jack. I will. We have resources they can't imagine. Legal teams, private investigators, financial analysts who can trace every penny they've stolen over the years." Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the lights of Silicon Valley spread out like a constellation of possibilities. Somewhere out there, in hospitals and clinics around the world, Sarah's algorithm was saving lives. Her vision of reducing human suffering through mathematical precision had become reality. But Jack felt no peace in that knowledge. The money in his accounts, the luxury surrounding him, the global impact of his wife's work, none of it could heal the fundamental damage that Frank and Martha had inflicted on his soul decades ago. "They won't stop until I'm dead," Jack said quietly. "Then we make sure they stop before that happens," Leo replied. "But first, you need to heal. Let the doctors fix your back, let yourself remember what it feels like to live without constant pain. The war with Frank and Martha can wait." Jack nodded, though he doubted that rest would come easily. Outside, the California night settled over the valley like a blanket, hiding the struggles of ordinary people beneath a canopy of stars that shone with the reflected light of extraordinary wealth. Sarah's journal sat in his lap, its glass protection reflecting his own image back at him. The man in the reflection looked tired and broken, but for the first time in years, there was something else in his eyes. Not hope, exactly, but the possibility that hope might someday return. The Superior Court of California stood like a marble temple to justice, its neoclassical columns reaching toward a sky obscured by San Francisco's perpetual fog. Jack sat in the plaintiff's section, his new suit fitting perfectly thanks to Leo's small army of assistants who'd attended to every detail of his appearance. 6 months of medical treatment had straightened his spine and filled out his frame. But no amount of physical therapy could prepare him for what was about to happen inside that courtroom. Frank and Martha occupied the defendant's table with their legal team, a collection of sharp-dressed attorneys from one of the city's most prestigious firms. Martha wore a conservative black dress that made her look like a grieving grandmother. Frank's gray suit was perfectly tailored, his white hair styled to suggest dignity and wisdom rather than the predatory cunning Jack knew lay beneath. "They look good," Leo murmured from beside him. "Professional coaching. Image consultants. They're playing the role perfectly." Jack watched his former foster parents through the glass partition that separated the gallery from the court proper. Martha was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Frank spoke in hushed, concerned tones to their lead attorney. To any observer, they appeared to be exactly what their lawsuit claimed: elderly victims of a sophisticated financial crime. The courtroom filled gradually with reporters, legal observers, and curious members of the public drawn by the case's high-profile nature. "Tech billionaire accused of defrauding foster parents" read the headline in that morning's Chronicle. The story had legs, as journalists like to say. It combined wealth, family drama, and the kind of moral complexity that drove social media engagement. Judge Patricia Hawkins took the bench at precisely 9 o'clock. Her black robes lending gravity to proceedings that Jack desperately wished he could avoid entirely. She was a veteran of the San Francisco judicial system, known for her no-nonsense approach to complex civil litigation. "Good morning," Judge Hawkins said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom's acoustics. "We're here for opening statements in the matter of Kowalski versus Miller." Counsel, you may proceed. Frank and Martha's attorney, a silver-haired man named Harrison Webb, rose with practiced grace. Webb had built his career defending the rights of elderly clients against financial exploitation. His opening statement was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation disguised as legal argument. Your Honor, Webb began, this case concerns the heartbreaking betrayal of an elderly couple by the foster child they raised as their own son. Webb painted a picture of Frank and Martha as loving parents who'd sacrificed their own comfort to provide for numerous foster children over the decades. He described Jack as a troubled young man with addiction issues who'd manipulated his way into their hearts and then their bank account. The defendants saved every penny for nearly 40 years. Webb continued, planning to use their modest retirement fund to help their son start a legitimate business. Instead, Mr. Miller took advantage of their grief following his wife's death to steal their life savings. Jack felt his hands clench into fists as Webb described the funeral scene, twisting the facts until Frank and Martha became concerned parents offering financial guidance to a distraught son. According to Webb's version, Jack had tricked them into signing documents that gave him access to their retirement accounts. $1 million, Your Honor. The entire sum they'd accumulated through decades of selfless service to society's most vulnerable children. Webb paused dramatically. Mr. Miller turned their generosity into the seed funding for a company now worth billions of dollars. The attorney gestured toward Jack with barely concealed disgust. The defense will try to paint my clients as opportunists seeking to profit from their son's success. But the evidence will show that Mr. Miller systematically exploited his position as their foster child to commit what can only be described as elder abuse on a massive scale. Webb's opening statement lasted nearly an hour. Each word carefully chosen to portray Jack as a master manipulator who'd preyed on the kindness of two innocent seniors. By the time he sat down, several jurors were looking at Jack with expressions of obvious disapproval. Leo's legal team had prepared Jack for this moment, explaining that the plaintiff's case would depend entirely on emotional manipulation rather than factual evidence. Still, hearing his life story twisted into a narrative of betrayal and abuse felt like being skinned alive in public. Sarah Tech's lead counsel, Amanda Rodriguez, approached the jury with quiet confidence. Rodriguez specialized in complex business litigation, her reputation built on an ability to dissect fraudulent claims with surgical precision. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Rodriguez began, you've just heard an elaborate fiction. A carefully constructed story designed to obscure a simple truth. Mr. and Mrs. Kowalski are attempting to steal money that was never theirs to begin with. Rodriguez methodically dismantled Webb's narrative, introducing evidence that Frank and Martha had been systematically defrauding state agencies for decades. Foster care payments collected for children who weren't receiving proper care. Disability benefits claimed for conditions that didn't exist. A pattern of exploitation that stretched back 30 years. The money Mr. Miller invested in Sarah Tech came from his wife's life insurance policy, Rodriguez explained. Documentation will show that Mr. Miller was the sole beneficiary of that policy, and that he had every legal right to use those funds as he saw fit. But even as Rodriguez presented the facts of the case with lawyerly precision, Jack could see that the emotional damage was already done. Webb's opening had planted seeds of doubt about Jack's character that would be difficult to uproot with mere evidence. The first day of testimony focused on Frank and Martha's background as foster parents. Webb paraded a series of character witnesses who testified about their decades of service to disadvantaged children. Former foster kids, now adults, spoke glowingly about the love and support they'd received in the Kowalski household. Jack listened to these testimonials with growing amazement. The foster home described by these witnesses bore no resemblance to the environment he'd experienced. Where was the mention of children forced to work unpaid jobs to supplement Frank's gambling income? Where were the stories about Martha's cruel punishments for minor infractions? They're coached, Leo whispered during a brief recess. Every single one of them has been prepared by Webb's team. Notice how they all use similar language, similar emotional beats. On the second day, Martha took the stand. She'd undergone a complete transformation since Jack had seen her at Sarah's funeral. Gone was the predatory confidence he remembered. In its place was a fragile elderly woman who spoke in trembling tones about the foster child she'd loved as her own son. Jack was different from the other children, Martha testified, her voice barely audible in the courtroom. Troubled, you know. He'd been through so much before he came to us. We tried to show him what a real family could be like. Webb guided her through a sanitized version of Jack's time in foster care, painting Frank and Martha as patient saints dealing with a difficult but beloved child. Martha described Jack's struggles with alcohol and gambling, his inability to hold steady employment, his periods of depression and anger. We never gave up on him, Martha continued, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. Even after he aged out of the system, we stayed in touch. We worried about him constantly, especially after he married that woman. The casual dismissal of Sarah hit Jack like a physical blow. Martha made it sound like Sarah had been a negative influence, a manipulative woman who'd encouraged Jack's worst tendencies. When Sarah died, we knew Jack would be lost without guidance, Martha testified. That's why we went to the funeral. To offer our support, our love, our assistance during his darkest hour. Webb produced a series of financial documents purporting to show that Frank and Martha had been saving money specifically to help Jack start a business. Bank statements, investment records, even handwritten notes discussing their plans for their son's future. We'd saved over $1 million, Martha sobbed. Every penny we could spare went into that account. It was going to be Jack's inheritance, his chance to build something meaningful with his life. The documents looked official, complete with dates and signatures that supported Martha's testimony. Jack's legal team had seen them during discovery, but proving they were fabricated would require forensic accounting that might take months to complete. And then Jack came to us with this terrible story about needing money for his wife's medical research, Martha continued. He said it was important, that it could help people. We believed him because we loved him. According to Martha's version of events, Jack had convinced them to sign over their retirement savings by claiming he needed capital to finish Sarah's work. They'd trusted him because he was family, because they wanted to support his efforts to honor his wife's memory. We only found out the truth when we saw him on television, Martha concluded, her voice breaking completely. Our retirement fund had become his business investment. The money we'd saved to help him had made him richer than we could ever imagine. During cross-examination, Rodriguez attempted to poke holes in Martha's testimony, but the emotional damage was already done. The jury saw a heartbroken elderly woman who'd been betrayed by the foster child she'd raised. Facts and evidence seemed secondary to the compelling human drama playing out before them. Frank's testimony followed the same pattern. He portrayed himself as a hardworking man who'd dedicated his life to helping disadvantaged children. His version of the funeral scene made him sound like a concerned father offering financial advice to a grieving son. I knew Jack wasn't thinking clearly, Frank testified. Losing Sarah had broken something inside him. When he started talking about investing in some crazy computer project, I tried to reason with him. But he was determined to throw our money away on his dead wife's fantasies. Frank's casual cruelty toward Sarah's memory sent waves of rage through Jack's nervous system. He gripped the arms of his chair, fighting the urge to stand up and scream the truth at this roomful of strangers. Leo's hand on his shoulder was the only thing that kept him seated. I signed those papers because I thought I was protecting him from himself, Frank continued. I thought if we controlled the money, we could make sure he didn't waste it all on drugs or gambling or whatever other demons he was fighting. By the end of the week, Webb had constructed a narrative that painted Jack as a manipulative addict who'd exploited his elderly foster parents' love and trust. The jury seemed completely convinced by the emotional testimony they'd heard. Jack sat in his hotel suite that weekend, staring out at the Golden Gate Bridge while contemplating the possibility that he might lose everything. Frank and Martha had hired better lawyers, told more convincing lies, and played their roles with Oscar-worthy commitment. They're good at this, Jack said to Leo. They've been running cons for so long that they actually believe their own lies. It's not over yet, Leo replied. Rodriguez hasn't presented our case. The jury hasn't seen the real evidence. But Jack could read the expressions on the jurors' faces. They'd already made up their minds about his character. Whatever evidence Rodriguez presented would be filtered through the assumption that Jack was fundamentally dishonest. fundamentally unworthy of the wealth that Sarah's algorithm had generated. Martha was right about one thing, Jack realized. He was different from the other foster children who'd testified on her behalf. He'd seen through Frank and Martha's manipulation from the beginning, had recognized them as predators wearing the masks of caretakers. And now, 30 years later, they were still wearing those same masks. Still running the same cons. Still destroying lives with surgical precision and practiced charm. The only question was whether a jury of strangers would be able to see past the performance to the predators beneath. Monday morning brought a different energy to the courtroom. Amanda Rodriguez moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent the weekend preparing to dismantle years of carefully constructed lies. Her legal team had arranged several monitors around the courtroom, suggesting that the defense case would rely heavily on documentation rather than emotional testimony. Your Honor, Rodriguez began, the plaintiff's case rests entirely on a fabricated narrative designed to obscure decades of systematic fraud. Today, we will show the jury who Frank and Martha Kowalski really are. The first piece of evidence was a series of IRS tax returns spanning 30 years. Rodriguez displayed them on the monitors, highlighting discrepancies between reported income and actual lifestyle expenses. Mr. and Mrs. Kowalski claimed poverty to state agencies while simultaneously maintaining a standard of living far beyond their reported means, Rodriguez explained. These tax documents show a pattern of unreported income that suggests systematic benefit fraud. The returns revealed that Frank and Martha had been claiming disability benefits for conditions that didn't exist, collecting unemployment while working under-the-table jobs, and reporting false income levels to qualify for housing assistance. The fraud totaled nearly $2 million over 3 decades. But the real crime, Rodriguez continued, was their exploitation of the foster care system. She produced state records showing that Frank and Martha had collected monthly payments for dozens of foster children over the years. But cross-referencing those records with school enrollment and medical visits revealed that many of those children had never actually lived in their home. They collected payments for ghost children, Rodriguez explained. Fictitious foster kids who existed only on paper. The money that Mr. and Mrs. Kowalski claimed to have saved for Mr. Miller's future was actually stolen from programs designed to protect society's most vulnerable members. Webb objected repeatedly, but Judge Hawkins allowed the evidence to stand. The documentation was official, sourced from multiple government agencies, and impossible to refute. Rodriguez then introduced financial records showing the actual source of the money that Jack had invested in Sarah Tech. Bank statements from Jack's account clearly showed the deposit of Sarah's life insurance payout, followed immediately by the withdrawal of the cashier's check he'd given to Leo. Mr. Miller never had access to any accounts belonging to Mr. and Mrs. Kowalski, Rodriguez stated. The money he invested came from his wife's life insurance policy, of which he was the sole legal beneficiary. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. Rodriguez introduced security footage from First National Bank of Detroit, recorded on the day Jack had cashed Sarah's insurance check. The black and white video showed Jack entering the bank alone, conducting his transaction without any contact from Frank or Martha. But as he left the building, the camera captured something more interesting. Frank and Martha were waiting in the parking lot, standing beside their black Lincoln Town car in animated conversation with 2 men in expensive suits. The timestamp showed this occurring approximately 2 hours after Jack had completed his transaction. Facial recognition software has identified these men as Anthony Torino and Vincent Massaro, associates of the Castellano crime family, Rodriguez announced. Phone records show that Mr. Kowalski contacted Mr. Torino within minutes of Mr. Miller leaving the cemetery on the day of the funeral. The implications hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Frank and Martha hadn't been concerned foster parents offering financial guidance. They'd been criminals coordinating with organized crime figures to steal money that had never belonged to them. Rodriguez played recorded phone conversations obtained through federal wiretaps related to an unrelated racketeering investigation. Frank's voice was clearly audible discussing plans to squeeze the foster kid and get our cut of the insurance money. The money doesn't exist yet, Frank's voice crackled through the courtroom speakers. But it will. The wife's dying, and Jackie boy's gonna be swimming in insurance cash. We just gotta make sure he signs the right papers. Martha's voice joined the conversation, her tone cold and calculating. Leave that to me. I can make Jackie do whatever I want. He's still that scared little kid who needs mommy's approval. The jury listened in stunned silence as Frank and Martha discussed their plans to defraud Jack of his wife's death benefit. Their conversation revealed intimate knowledge of Sarah's condition, her insurance policy, and Jack's emotional vulnerability. But the most damning evidence came when Rodriguez introduced Leo's own testimony. Leo took the stand wearing a simple business suit rather than his usual designer attire, projecting competence and sincerity rather than wealth. Mr. Miller saved my life, Leo testified simply. I was being beaten by loan sharks, living in a condemned garage, about to lose everything I'd worked for. Jack gave me his wife's entire life insurance payout, every penny he had in the world. Leo described the scene in the garage, Frank's swollen face, and Jack's quiet determination to honor Sarah's memory by completing her research. He told me not to look for him until I made it, Leo continued. He disappeared completely, living off the grid to protect himself and the algorithm from people who wanted to suppress Sarah's work. Rodriguez guided Leo through the technical details of Sarah's algorithm, explaining how her diagnostic software had revolutionized cancer treatment worldwide. The company's success wasn't built on stolen money, but on brilliant research that had taken years to develop into commercially viable software. Without Mr. Miller's investment, none of this would exist, Leo concluded. Millions of patients would still be receiving misdiagnosed or ineffective treatments. Sarah's work would have died with her. But Rodriguez wasn't finished. She called Drive. Elizabeth Warner, a federal forensic accountant who'd spent 6 months analyzing Frank and Martha's financial records. The documents presented by the plaintiffs are sophisticated forgeries, Drive. Warner testified. Bank statements, investment records, even handwritten notes, all fabricated within the last 18 months. Using software designed to create historical financial documentation. Dr. Warner explained how advances in digital printing and document creation had made it possible to manufacture convincing fake records that could fool casual inspection. But detailed analysis revealed watermark inconsistencies, ink composition anachronisms, and other technical flaws that exposed the forgeries. The plaintiffs never saved money for Mr. Miller's benefit, Drive. Warner concluded. They never had legitimate access to the funds he invested in Sarah Tech. Their entire case is built on fabricated evidence. Webb's cross-examination was aggressive but ultimately futile. The forensic evidence was overwhelming, supported by federal records that couldn't be disputed or explained away. On Thursday afternoon, Rodriguez called Jack to the stand. He'd dreaded this moment for weeks, but as he raised his right hand to take the oath, Jack felt something unexpected: relief. Mr. Miller, Rodriguez began, please tell the jury about your experience in the Kowalski foster home. Jack took a deep breath and began speaking about things he'd never discussed publicly. The unpaid labor, the emotional manipulation, the systematic exploitation of foster children who had no other options. They collected checks for kids who never lived there, Jack testified. Phantom children who existed only in their paperwork. The real kids were used as unpaid workers in Frank's various schemes. He described the atmosphere of fear that pervaded the household, where children learned to avoid drawing attention to themselves lest they become targets for Martha's psychological abuse. Frank would threaten to send us back to state custody if we complained about anything, Jack continued. He made it clear that we were disposable, that our only value was the monthly payments we generated. Jack's testimony painted a picture of systematic abuse that contradicted everything the jury had heard during the plaintiff's case. But more importantly, it explained why Jack had been so desperate to escape their influence as an adult. When Sarah died, I knew Frank and Martha would come for the insurance money, Jack testified. They'd been asking about her policy for months before she passed away. They saw her terminal diagnosis as a financial opportunity. Webb's cross-examination was brutal, focusing on Jack's history with addiction and his years living off the grid in Texas. But Jack answered each question with quiet honesty, acknowledging his mistakes while refusing to accept blame for crimes he hadn't committed. Mr. Miller, Webb asked with barely concealed contempt, isn't it true that you abandoned your foster parents for 5 years because you were consumed by guilt over stealing their life savings? Jack looked directly at the jury before answering. I disappeared because I was afraid they'd find a way to take Sarah's legacy away from me. I was afraid they'd destroy the only good thing that might come from her death. So you admit that you were afraid of my clients? I was afraid of what they represented, Jack replied. People who profit from other people's pain. People who see tragedy as opportunity. Webb pressed harder, but Jack's testimony remained consistent and compelling. He spoke about Sarah's work with genuine passion, describing her vision of reducing human suffering through mathematical precision. My wife spent 15 years developing algorithms that could save lives, Jack concluded. Frank and Martha wanted to turn her death into their retirement plan. I couldn't let that happen. On Friday morning, Rodriguez presented her closing argument with the efficiency of a surgeon removing a tumor. She methodically destroyed each element of the plaintiff's case, using their own evidence against them. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about more than money, Rodriguez concluded. It's about protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit them. Mr. and Mrs. Kowalski spent decades running sophisticated cons against the very system designed to help disadvantaged children. She gestured toward Frank and Martha, who sat stone-faced at their table. They're not victims. They're predators who saw an opportunity to claim credit for someone else's success and took it. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood with the kind of expression that suggested the verdict had been unanimous and decisive. In the matter of Kowalski versus Miller, the foreman announced, "We find in favor of the defendants on all counts." But Judge Hawkins wasn't finished. Based on the evidence of fraud presented during the trial, she referred Frank and Martha's case to the U.S. Attorney's Office for federal prosecution. They would face charges related to their decades of benefit fraud and their attempted theft of Jack's insurance settlement. As U.S. Marshals approached their table with handcuffs, Frank finally dropped his mask of elderly dignity. "You ungrateful bastard," he screamed at Jack. "We gave you everything. You gave me nothing but pain," Jack replied quietly. "But you taught me something valuable. You taught me the difference between family and people who pretend to care about you." Martha was sobbing as the marshals led her away, but Jack felt no satisfaction in her tears. They were just another performance, another attempt to manipulate sympathy from anyone willing to watch. As Jack walked down the courthouse steps, his back straight and his head high, he realized that something fundamental had changed inside him. The fear that had driven him into the Texas desert was gone, replaced by a sense of justice finally served. Leo waited beside a black sedan, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. "How does it feel to be free?" Jack paused on the bottom step, looking back at the courthouse where Frank and Martha would face real consequences for the first time in their lives. "It feels like Sarah can finally rest in peace," Jack said simply. The California sunshine felt warm on his face as they drove away from the courthouse. Leaving the past behind and heading toward whatever future awaited a man who'd learned that sometimes the only way to win is to refuse to play by someone else's rules. The ballroom of the Fairmont San Francisco glittered like a constellation brought down to earth. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across walls draped in midnight blue silk. 500 of Silicon Valley's most influential leaders filled the space, their conversations creating a low hum of anticipation mixed with the soft jazz quartet playing near the entrance. Jack stood at the edge of the crowd, adjusting the bow tie of his first custom tuxedo. 6 months after the trial's conclusion, he still felt like an imposter in settings like this. The suit fit perfectly, tailored by craftsmen who'd taken measurements with the precision of engineers. But underneath the expensive fabric, Jack remained the same blue-collar mechanic who'd once eaten expired soup in a Texas trailer. "You look nervous," Leo observed, approaching with 2 glasses of champagne. "I am nervous," Jack admitted, accepting the drink he probably wouldn't finish. "This isn't my world, Leo. I don't know how to talk to these people." "You don't need to talk to them," Leo replied. "They need to listen to you. There's a difference." Through the ballroom's floor-to-ceiling windows, San Francisco Bay stretched toward the horizon, its dark waters reflecting the lights of Oakland and Berkeley. Somewhere out there, in hospitals and clinics around the world, Sarah's diagnostic algorithm was analyzing patient data and saving lives. Her vision had become reality, touching millions of people who would never know her name. At the center of the ballroom stood a display that had drawn constant attention throughout the evening. Jack's restored pickup truck, the same vehicle that had carried him through 5 years in the Texas oil fields, sat under carefully arranged spotlights. But it had been transformed, lovingly restored to its original condition while maintaining the character that decades of hard use had etched into its frame. The truck's presence wasn't accidental. Jack had insisted it be part of tonight's presentation, a tangible reminder of the journey that had brought them all to this moment. Beside it, a large monitor displayed real-time statistics from Sarah Tech's global network: patients diagnosed, treatments optimized, lives saved. Ladies and gentlemen, the evening's master of ceremonies announced, please welcome Jack Miller, co-founder of Sarah Tech and founder of the Sarah Miller Foundation. Jack walked to the podium with steady steps, his back straight and strong thanks to the spinal surgery that had finally freed him from chronic pain. The applause was polite but genuine, these successful people recognizing someone who'd earned his place among them through sacrifice rather than inheritance. Thank you, Jack began, his voice carrying clearly through the room's acoustic system. Most of you know me as the man who invested in Leo's startup 5 years ago. But that's not really who I am. He paused, looking out at faces that represented billions of dollars in combined wealth. Tech entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, pharmaceutical executives, medical researchers. People who shaped the future through innovation and investment. I'm a mechanic, Jack continued. I spent my whole life fixing things that were broken, trying to make them work a little better, last a little longer. When my wife Sarah died, I was broken too. But instead of fixing myself, I made a different choice. Jack gestured toward the restored pickup truck. I bet everything I had on someone else's potential. I gave Leo my wife's life insurance money, every penny, because I believed Sarah's work could change the world. The audience listened with the kind of focused attention that money couldn't buy. Jack's story had become legend in Silicon Valley, but most had never heard it told in his own words. The Sarah Miller Foundation represents a different kind of investment, Jack explained. Instead of betting on the next breakthrough technology, we're investing in the people that technology often leaves behind. The foundation's mission was simple but revolutionary. Using a portion of Jack's Sarah Tech profits, they would provide housing, healthcare, and educational support for aging blue-collar workers who'd been discarded by an economy that no longer valued manual labor. They would also establish support systems for foster children aging out of state care, ensuring that young people like Jack had options beyond exploitation or abandonment. We're building communities, Jack continued, places where dignity isn't determined by your stock portfolio or your educational pedigree. Places where a mechanic and a software engineer can live as neighbors, each contributing their own skills to something bigger than themselves. The foundation's pilot project was already under construction in Detroit, transforming abandoned neighborhoods into mixed-income communities that combined affordable housing with makerspaces, community gardens, and intergenerational programming. It was urban renewal designed by the people who would actually live there. My wife believed that complex problems required elegant solutions, Jack said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke about Sarah's legacy. The Sarah Miller Foundation is our attempt to solve the complex problem of economic inequality with the elegant solution of human dignity. After his speech, guests mingled around elaborate food stations while jazz musicians played softly in the background. Jack found himself in conversations with people whose names he'd seen in Forbes and Fortune, discussing implementation strategies for foundation programs and funding mechanisms for community development projects. Leo appeared at his elbow during a brief lull in the conversations. There's someone I want you to meet, he said, guiding Jack toward a quiet corner where a distinguished older woman was examining the pickup truck display. Dr. Sarah Chen, Leo announced. She runs the oncology program at UCSF. Dr. Chen, this is Jack Miller. Dr. Chen turned with a smile that transformed her serious features. Mr. Miller, I've been hoping to meet you. Your wife's algorithm has revolutionized how we approach cancer treatment. We've reduced diagnostic errors by 80% since implementing Sarah Tech's software. She spoke about specific cases where Sarah's algorithm had caught cancers that human doctors had missed, treatments that had been optimized through mathematical analysis, families who'd been spared the agony of misdiagnosis and failed therapies. Last week alone, we used Sarah's work to help 17 patients receive targeted treatments instead of broad-spectrum chemotherapy. Drive. Chen continued. That's 17 people who will suffer less, heal faster, and have a better chance of seeing their children grow up. Jack listened to these stories with a mixture of pride and overwhelming sadness. Sarah had never lived to see her work's global impact. Never experienced the satisfaction of knowing that her equations were reducing human suffering on a massive scale. She would have loved meeting the patients, Jack said quietly. Sarah always said the mathematics didn't matter unless it helped real people. Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. The most remarkable thing about Sarah's algorithm isn't its technical sophistication. It's the humanity embedded in every equation. You can tell it was created by someone who understood that statistics represent human lives. As the evening drew to a close, Jack stood once again beside his restored pickup truck. The ballroom was emptying gradually, guests departing with business cards exchanged and commitments made. The foundation's launch had exceeded every expectation, generating both financial support and operational partnerships that would accelerate their community development work. Leo approached carrying a set of keys attached to a distinctive keychain. I have something for you, he said, holding up the keys to reveal the Tesla logo. It's the new Roadster, Leo explained. 0 to 60 in under 2 seconds. Completely silent. The most advanced electric vehicle ever built. He extended the keys toward Jack. Consider it a gift. A symbol of the future we're building together. Jack looked at the keys for a long moment, then smiled and shook his head. Thanks, Leo, but I'll stick with the truck. The truck? Leo looked genuinely confused. Jack, it's 40 years old. The Tesla has more computing power than most spacecraft. But I can fix the truck myself, Jack replied, running his hand along the pickup's faded paint. I understand every bolt, every wire, every system. It represents something I never want to lose. Leo studied Jack's expression, then slowly returned the Tesla keys to his pocket. You're talking about more than automotive preferences. I'm talking about remembering where I came from, Jack said. This truck carried me through the worst years of my life. It never broke down when I needed it most. That kind of reliability is worth more than the latest technology. They stood in comfortable silence, watching as the catering staff began clearing tables and the jazz quartet packed their instruments. Outside the ballroom windows, San Francisco's lights twinkled like earthbound stars. Sarah would be proud of you, Leo said finally. Jack considered this statement, weighing its truth against his own complicated feelings about success and survival. I think she'd be proud of us both. But mostly, I think she'd be proud that her work continues. As if summoned by their conversation, Jack noticed a massive portrait of Sarah that had been unveiled near the ballroom's exit. The painting showed her as Jack remembered her best. Sitting at their kitchen table with her notebook open, pencil in hand, eyes bright with the excitement of discovery. The artist had captured not just her physical appearance but the sense of intellectual curiosity that had defined her entire approach to life. Jack walked toward the portrait, Leo following quietly behind. Other guests had noticed the painting throughout the evening, many stopping to read the small brass plaque that explained Sarah's contribution to medical science. She looks happy, Jack observed, studying the painted version of his wife's face. She was happy, Leo replied. Every time she talked about her research, every time she described the potential impact of her work. Sarah knew she was onto something revolutionary. Jack reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small, leather-bound object. Sarah's original research notebook, the one Frank had knocked into the mud at her funeral. It had been restored and preserved, but Jack carried a smaller version with him everywhere, a replica containing her most important equations. Thank you, Sarah, Jack whispered, his words barely audible in the vast ballroom. For believing that broken things could be fixed. For showing me that the most important investments aren't financial. He tucked the notebook back into his pocket, where it rested against his heart like a talisman. Around them, the staff continued their cleanup work, transforming the elegant ballroom back into an empty space waiting for the next celebration. Ready to go home? Leo asked. Jack took one last look at Sarah's portrait, memorizing the details of her expression. More than ready. They walked toward the exit together, their footsteps echoing in the gradually emptying ballroom. Behind them, the restored pickup truck sat under its spotlights, a monument to the journey that had brought them all to this moment of triumph and remembrance. Outside, San Francisco's cool night air carried the scent of bay water and distant rain. Jack breathed deeply, filling his lungs with the promise of tomorrow while his heart carried the unshakable presence of yesterday's love. Life doesn't end just because it breaks once. What falls apart can be the very place where we learn to stand again. The Foundation's work would continue, touching lives in ways that spreadsheets and quarterly reports could never measure. Sarah's algorithm would keep evolving, saving patients whose names Jack would never know, but whose survival honored her memory in the most meaningful way possible. If this story gave even a small moment of strength to someone out there, then everything I went through means something today. Success, Jack realized, wasn't measured in billions of dollars or global recognition. It was measured in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that love could survive death. That sacrifice could produce meaning, and that broken people could choose to heal not just themselves but the world around them. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe, and share a piece of your own story in the comments below. Your words might become the seed of the next chapter we create together. The black sedan waited at the curb, its driver patient and professional. As Jack settled into the leather seat, he caught his reflection in the window and saw something that had been missing for too many years: peace. Thank you for spending